Let us turn now together to our next reading from Scripture, the prophet Jeremiah. Chapter 23, verses 1 through 6. Ah, shepherds, who let the flock of my pasture stray and scatter, declares the Lord. Assuredly, thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who should tend my people. It is you who let my flock scatter and go astray. You gave no thought to them, but I am going to give thought to you for your wicked acts, declares the Lord. And I myself will gather the remnant of my flock from all the lands to which I have banished them. And I will bring them back to their pasture, where they shall be fertile and increase. And I will appoint over them shepherds who will tend them. They shall no longer fear or be dismayed, and none of them shall be missing, declares the Lord. See, a time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up a true branch of David's line. He shall reign as king and shall prosper, and he shall do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Judah shall be delivered, and Israel shall dwell secure. And this is the name by which he shall be called. The Lord is our vindicator. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. This is the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. A time is coming, declares the Lord. Now, that's the point where Jeremiah's message for this morning leads to. The great word of hope for the future, of restoration, of security and prosperity. Though, as is true to the spirit of Jeremiah, the rest of his words can be a little more tough to deal with. Jeremiah, as we talked about in Bible study, is a peripheral prophet. All right, now those of you in the Bible study didn't realize that would be useful to know, did you? He is a prophet from among the people, as opposed to a court prophet who is among the king in the king's court. The court prophet would be someone more like Samuel, who was right at the king's side all the time, giving advice, giving correction, but always having the ear of the king. As opposed to the peripheral prophet who's more among the people. In today's world, we can kind of compare this to ministers, as it might help us visualize this difference. We can think of someone like Billy Graham as being a court minister, as Billy Graham is like the president's minister for years and years and years, always having the ear of the president. As opposed to someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who would have been a peripheral minister, who was for more among the people, offering more criticism and call for change. Peripheral prophets such as Jeremiah are really known most for their harsh criticism of corrupted leadership, and their calls for change, calls for the system to be straightened out. As he is doing here, Jeremiah is criticizing Israel's leaders for leading people astray. Now, Jeremiah speaks God's words and uses the image of the shepherd to make the point. God says to the shepherds who are supposed to be tending God's people, "It is you who let my flock scatter and go astray. You gave no thought to them, but I'm going to give thought to you for your wicked acts." Now, not much is said specifically about what those leaders did, but we do get some ideas. Their wicked acts. Whatever those acts were exactly, they brought guilt upon the people, brought punishment upon the people, brought destruction and exile. from Israel all the way up to Babylon, for 2 generations. This is the actions that were ultimately caused by Israel's leadership leading them astray. That's what we find here. And ultimately, those acts lead to fear, lead to dismay, lead to suffering. Israel being scattered into foreign lands, completely scattered, separated from loved ones, just thrown into the midst of captivity, of exile. And we do know that Jeremiah had his sights set especially on an earlier king, Zedekiah, who was a puppet for Babylon, kind of doing the bidding of Babylon for the most part, and then he turned against Babylon and then caused a revolt and all this stuff. So Zedekiah was basically a puppet who was criticized a lot by Jeremiah. And then later it was Jehoiakim, who was another puppet, but much worse than Zedekiah. Jehoiakim was probably an example of one of the worst kings of Israel. All this ultimately led to the scattering. The way that they impacted the people led to the exile. So not only are we talking about the flock being scattered physically, or spiritually, psychologically, economically, but we are talking about that huge physical separation in their case, and that the shepherds' actions led precisely to Israel's exile. I can't stress that point enough, because the real temptation with this passage is to compare it directly with our own situation today. Now, there are some things that we can compare directly, but it's really not the same situation. For Israel, now their political leaders, they were doing what they were doing in order to maintain the kingdom in ways that they thought were the right ways, and ways that struck them as the correct ways to go about it, in maintaining their kingdom, maintaining their power, keeping their authority as much as they could, knowing that these dangerous empires were looming. What they were doing in the wrong ways, and this is how they were leading people astray. They weren't listening to God's instructions that was coming through prophets like Jeremiah as far as how to deal with these situations. It was their alignment with neighboring empires and societies that ultimately undermined God's will for them. And that's where they got on the wrong path. Now for us, right, we got our political leaders, and this is who we want to point fingers at when we hear a passage like this, talking about the leaders leading the people astray. All our troubles with our political leaders, as they're the ones most in the eye of the public. Now, for our political leaders, it's kind of a different situation, because we find them selling out more to, private interests, things that will get them votes. So just saying and doing things that will get them votes, not because they care about anybody's well-being, but it's a self-interest kind of thing, more of an all-about-me kind of attitude. And then we contribute to that because our political leaders depend on us in our kind of society to vote for them. And the majority of us voting puts them into the office and then continues them being in office. We contribute to who is there and what they do, because they completely do what we desire so that they can get their power. I mean, it's just a different situation. Our culture operates under an all-about-me kind of attitude. We just continue running that route as long as we focus on all-about-me kind of things. That I am the most important, what I want is the most important, and our politicians do the same thing. They're just trying to maintain their own personal power. Now, what does compare directly here with our situation to the ancient situation in the passage is the undermining of God's will, which results in the incredible need for justice and righteousness to become more widely known. In the prophet's perspective, what happened, Israel's suffering and scattering and exile was the direct result of undermining God's will. And for us, we have our own direct results of undermining God's will. I believe, as an author, John Holbert, puts it, 1% of our people hold as many resources in their hands as 40% of the rest of us. and the bottom 20% have so few resources that they don't even register on any graph or pie chart. I mean, those are scary numbers. There's obviously something wrong when you get results like that. So what the answer is, I mean, who knows? We can argue all these political answers, but none of them are really right. I mean, what we find here is this need to return to God's will, true care and compassion. That's going to get us back on the right path. One way or another, one political side or another, none of that, I think, is really going to determine the answer. There's a whole lot of scattering going on in our society. Even though it's not a physical exile, there's a lot of spiritual scattering, a lot of psychological scattering, a lot of economic scattering, a lot of scattering that produces suffering. And that's the part that can be compared. This message does well in speaking not only to the corrupted leaders at the time, or even the corrupted leaders of our time. It does well to speak to all of us. Now, of course, we do want to identify only with the people who have bad leaders at that time, and, for good reason, because we can identify terrible leaders in our time. Absolutely. Probably all of us, at one point or another in our lives, have been led astray. Just like this guy. So this guy took directions, on his cell phone. He's got GPS, and that GPS led him astray and led him right into that water where he's sinking. So, what I'm saying with that picture is that probably all of us have been led astray by somebody or something at some point in our lives. Now think in your life, how have you been led astray? By a politician, by a pastor, by a teacher, by any other kind of leader? How have you been led astray by somebody in your life? Now of course, we want to point our fingers, right? Point our fingers and say, that's the bad guy. But the bigger question is, how have you in your life maybe led someone else astray? How have you been that stumbling block for somebody else? How have you perhaps caused others to scatter one way or another? How can we identify with these bad leaders that Jeremiah was pointing out? According to Jeremiah, the judgment comes down to one thing: our concern for justice and righteousness for the people of God. So are you as concerned as you should be about a just and right environment for your people? Through Jeremiah, it's declared that a time is coming when God will raise up a true branch of David. He shall reign as king, and he shall dwell secure and lead us into God's justice and righteousness, the most true of ways. In the Gospel of Luke, we find Jesus on the cross. We find him showing what it comes down to as far as having concern for justice and the righteousness of your own people. And this true branch of David carries the spirit of the true king, Jesus, as we find him on the cross, giving his own life out of his concern for a just and right environment for his people. In this story, we see what it means to really be brought together from fear and dismay, gathered together into love under the leadership of a good shepherd, a leader who gives his own life for us. And notice the response. The response is a very telling one. Those thieves that are up with Jesus on their crosses. The thieves that are also dying a thief's death, a criminal's death. Notice what happens with them, as one of them just is mocking Jesus and saying, well, you're the Messiah, right? Well, save yourself and save us too. acting just like those who put him up there in the first place. And then you've got the other one. And the other one shows this incredible change in attitude, this change in mentality, identifying Jesus as the Messiah, with the true and deep desire to be with Jesus in his kingdom, to be gathered with the people under Jesus' leadership. And Jesus gives him this promise. He identifies that change of heart, says, "You will be with me in paradise." We must each receive a change in attitude, a change in mentality, if we want to be a part of God's solution. A change from trying to build up our own kingdoms. A change from saying, "My will be done." Changing into being led by God alone. And saying truthfully to the Lord, not just repeating it every week, with all redundancy, but saying truthfully to the Lord, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." May we humble ourselves and invite the Lord to be our true shepherd. May we allow our attitudes and mentalities to be shaped and molded by God's will. May we look forward to the time when justice and righteousness of God's kingdom will be established on all the earth. Amen.